The sound of heavy breathing echoed through the dark room. The single light bulb overhead flickered, threatening to go out. 13-year-old Sarah sat curled in the corner, her small hands bound tightly with coarse rope. Outside the steel door, the slow, heavy footsteps of a man thudded closer, each step pounding fear deeper into her chest. "You won't get out," his raspy voice growled through the crack. "No one can hear you." Sarah lifted her tear-streaked face. Her lips trembled, but instead of screaming or begging, she began to sing. At first, her voice quivered, fragile, but then it grew stronger, clear, haunting, and piercing through the suffocating silence. The man stopped in his tracks. Why? In this moment of terror, would Sarah choose to sing? And how could this voice become the very thing that led to his arrest only hours later? The day had begun like any other in the small Ohio town where Sarah lived. The streets were lined with maple trees that had just begun to lose their leaves, their branches scattering orange and gold across the sidewalks. The town was the kind of place where neighbors waved from porches, where shopkeepers knew children by name, where the pace of life felt predictable and safe. Sarah, 13 years old, with hair the color of chestnuts and eyes too large for her small face, liked that. Predictability. She found comfort in routine. She woke up to the sound of her mother humming in the kitchen, scrambled to find both socks in the chaos of her bedroom, and packed her lunch in the same faded pink box she had used for 3 years. She was not remarkable in ways the world usually notices, but she had a gift, one that even she did not fully understand. Her mother, Lydia, worked long hours at a lounge in town. By night, Lydia sang for strangers sipping whiskey under dim light. By day, she was simply Mom, with tired eyes and a warm laugh that never failed to comfort Sarah. Whenever Sarah complained about missing her mother's presence, Lydia would kneel down and brush Sarah's hair back, whispering the same words every time. "Music can reach places words never can. As long as you keep your voice, Sarah, you will never be alone." That phrase had become a secret shield for Sarah. She believed it, clung to it, even if she didn't always understand how it could be true. At school, she wasn't popular. She wasn't the kind of girl who led playground games or told jokes that made entire classrooms laugh. She was quieter, more thoughtful. A dreamer who found herself staring out of windows during math class, humming softly while writing notes in the margins of her notebook. Teachers noticed her gentleness, her kindness toward others, even when she herself felt invisible. It was music that made her visible. On Sunday mornings, she sang in the church choir. Her voice, soft, pure, and unexpectedly powerful, would rise above the rest. People turned their heads, curious that such a small girl carried a sound so steady. But Sarah never sang for attention. She sang because it made her feel less alone, because each note felt like a thread tying her to something greater than herself. That afternoon, after school ended, Sarah stayed late as she often did. She liked helping Mrs. Carlson, the art teacher, wash paintbrushes and tidy the classroom. The smell of turpentine and chalk dust clung to her clothes as she packed her books. Outside, the sky had turned pale with early autumn dusk. "Do you want me to call your mom to pick you up?" Mrs. Carlson asked, her hands deep in a sink of cloudy water. Sarah shook her head. "I like the air, Weed. I like the air." Teacher smiled, though her brow furrowed slightly with concern. "All right then. Be careful, Sarah. Be careful." The word echoed in her mind as she stepped out into the fading light. She clutched her backpack straps tight and began the walk home, humming under her breath, as she often did. The streets were mostly empty, just a few cars parked along the curb and the distant bark of a dog. Sarah liked this time of day, the in-between, when the world wasn't yet night but no longer day. It felt like her own private hour, where she could imagine she was the only one alive, the only one who could see the sky shifting to lavender. But as she turned down a quieter street, the air shifted. A chill skated across her arms. She noticed a van parked at the corner, its paint dull and weathered, its windows dark. She told herself it was nothing. Cars parked all the time. Still, her humming faltered. She walked faster. The van's engine roared to life. Sarah's heart jumped. She quickened her pace, gripping her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles whitened. She told herself not to look back, but her feet faltered when the sound of tires crunching gravel came closer. Closer still. The van slowed beside her, the sliding door screeched open. Sarah barely had time to gasp. Hand shot out, rough and unyielding, clamping around her arm. She screamed, but the sound was smothered by a rag pressed against her mouth. A sharp chemical scent invaded her nose, burning her throat. She kicked, twisted, tried to fight, but the world spun into a blur of headlights and shadows. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was the line of maple trees swaying silently in the wind as if waving goodbye. When she woke, the light was different, dimmer, harsher. Gone were the maple trees, the sidewalks, the safety of her neighborhood. Now there was only concrete. When Sarah's eyes fluttered open, she was no longer in the world she knew. The first thing she noticed was the cold. It seeped into her bones, unforgiving and raw, as though the floor beneath her was a sheet of ice. The second thing was the silence thicker than anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't the gentle quiet of her room at home or the stillness of the church when the choir took a breath before singing. This silence was heavy, oppressive, almost alive. She pushed herself up with trembling arms, only to feel the bite of rope around her wrists. Her skin was raw where the fibers dug into her. She pulled against them, twisting, hoping the knots might give way, but they held firm. Her heart pounded wildly. The memory of the van slammed into her like a violent echo, the screech of the door, the rag pressed against her mouth, the dizzying burn in her lungs. She had screamed then, she was sure of it, but no one had come. Now her voice caught in her throat, paralyzed between the urge to cry out and the terror that someone might actually answer. The room was small, barely large enough for her to stretch out her legs. Its walls were concrete, rough and unpainted, with cracks that crawled upward like veins. The only light came from a single bulb dangling from the ceiling, swaying ever so slightly, buzzing faintly. It flickered now and then, threatening to leave her in total darkness, against the far wall. A heavy steel door stood closed, paint peeled from its surface in jagged strips. The sight of it filled Sarah with dread because it meant someone had put her here. Someone who held the key. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Hello?" The sound startled her, bouncing back from the walls. She tried again, louder this time. "Hello, please, somebody help me. Nothing?" The silence pressed closer, wrapping around her chest until it was hard to breathe. Then a metallic scrape. Sarah froze. The small gap beneath the door rattled. A tray slid through, skidding across the floor until it hit her leg. On it sat a bottle of water and a sandwich wrapped in crinkled plastic. Her stomach growled painfully, but fear outweighed hunger. She stared at the tray, waiting, listening, footsteps, slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. They stopped right outside. The door, Sarah's throat tightened. The lock clicked once, then stopped. A voice seeped through the metal, low and rough, carrying the weight of smoke and gravel. "Eat it," said. Sarah's eyes widened. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Her voice cracked, part plea, part demand. Silence followed. Retreated, fading into nothingness, tears welled in her eyes. She didn't want the sandwich, but eventually hunger won. She tore at the plastic with bound hands, fumbling clumsily, eating in silence. The bread was stale. The water was lukewarm, but it kept her from collapsing. Time lost its shape in the concrete. Room. Sometimes the bulb flickered so often she wasn't sure if minutes or hours had passed. Sometimes she fell asleep only to wake in the same suffocating silence. The same walls, the same door. The trays kept coming, always without words, always with the sound of dragging boots. Sarah tried everything. She screamed until her throat burned raw. She banged her fists against the door until her knuckles bled, until her legs gave out. Nothing changed. Her voice became hoarse, her body weak. But what terrified her most wasn't the ropes or the door. It was the silence. At night she lay on the floor with her ear pressed to the cold concrete, desperate to hear something, anything that reminded her she wasn't the only person left in the world. She thought she heard wind once, faint and whistling through a vent high above. Another time she thought she caught the distant hum of traffic. But maybe it was just her imagination. Loneliness crept in like poison. She began to wonder, what if no one was looking for me? What if Mom thinks I ran away? What if the world forgets me here? Her thoughts spiraled. She pictured her mother singing in the lounge, her voice pouring into an audience that would never know her daughter was gone. She imagined her classmates laughing on the playground, her seat empty, her name not spoken. She imagined her house at night, her bed cold, her favorite books stacked untouched. The idea of vanishing terrified her more than the man outside the door. On the third night, when the bulb flickered in and out like a dying heartbeat, Sarah curled into herself, sobbing quietly. Her chest hurt from crying. Her throat burned from screaming. She was too tired to fight anymore. And then, like a whisper carried across time, she heard her mother's voice in memory. Music can reach places words never can. As long as you keep your voice, Sarah, you will never be alone. Words lingered, sharp and clear. Her tears slowed. She lifted her head, sniffled, and whispered into the empty room. Sing? Her lips trembled. The first sound that came out was barely more than a hum, broken and off-key. She stopped, terrified. The man might hear. But then another thought struck her. Maybe that's the point. Maybe someone will hear. Her next attempt came steadier, a hymn simple and familiar, one she'd sung beside her mother in church. The first note wavered, but then the second followed, then the third. Slowly the sound filled the room, echoing against the walls, pushing back the silence. For the first time since the van door had slammed shut, Sarah felt something stir inside her. Hope, she sang louder, and outside the footsteps stopped. The first note left Sarah's lips like a fragile thread of light piercing through darkness. It quivered, hesitant, as though even her own ears might reject it. But when it echoed off the concrete walls and came back to her, she realized something astonishing. It made the room less empty. She closed her eyes and sang again, this time stronger. A hymn she remembered from Sunday service, the kind where her mother squeezed her hand while their voices mingled with the congregation. The melody rose slowly, a soft river that swelled until it filled every corner of the room. For the first time since she had been dragged into this nightmare, Sarah felt a flicker of power not over the ropes or the door, but over herself. Singing reminded her she was alive. Outside the steel door, the man froze. He had been halfway down the corridor, his boots dragging the same way they always did, when the sound stopped him cold. At first he thought it was in his head, some phantom memory. But then he heard it again, a girl's voice, high, pure, trembling, yet stubbornly steady, his fists clenched. It shouldn't have mattered. She was just another runaway, another problem. To disappear, but the sound? It scraped against something deep inside him, something he thought he had buried years ago. Images flooded his mind, images of a little girl with braids, sitting on the floor of a living room, singing along to the radio. His daughter, Emily. He pressed his hands against his ears, but it was too late. Memory had already clawed its way to the surface. He saw the headlights, the twisted wreck, the silence that had followed. He remembered screaming her name until his voice cracked, but Emily never answered. After that, he swore he would never listen to music again. Yet here it was, invading him through the walls of this house, through the voice of the child he had taken. He stumbled back. Cursing under his breath, inside, Sarah kept singing. She didn't know what reaction her voice might stir in the man outside. For all she knew, it would enrage him, make him burst through the door to silence her forever. But the more she sang, the more her fear melted into something else. Defiance. If she couldn't escape, she could still refuse to vanish into silence. Her songs became her clock, her way of measuring time in a place where the days bled together. In the mornings, she sang softly, lullabies her mother used to hum while braiding her hair. At night, she reached for hymns, their steady patterns soothing her like a heartbeat. Sometimes she even whispered nonsense tunes she made up, the kind she once hummed while doodling in class. Each note reminded her of home. And sometimes, she thought she heard the faintest answer, not words, but the sound of movement outside the door, a shuffle, a pause, as if someone lingered to listen. For the man, it was torture. He told himself he hated it, that it made his head throb and his chest ache, but he couldn't stay away. Night after night, he sat in the hall with his back against the steel door, listening despite himself. The girl's voice gnawed at him. It dragged Emily's memory out of the shadows. It forced him to remember things he wanted erased. Bedtime stories, sticky fingers on piano keys, the way she once begged him to clap along to her songs. He wanted to hate Sarah for it. He wanted to storm in, shout at her, demand she stop. But when he tried to imagine opening the door, he felt his throat close. Because the truth was, he didn't want it to stop. Her voice filled a silence that had haunted him for years. Sarah noticed subtle changes. The trays of food arrived at the same time, but now the footsteps lingered. Once, she even heard the lock click halfway, as if he had thought about coming in but changed his mind. It terrified her and gave her hope in equal measure. She wondered, why does he stay? Why doesn't he stop me? Perhaps her songs unsettled him. Perhaps they reached him the way her mother always promised music could reach anyone. That thought became fuel. One night while singing a hymn, Sarah let her voice swell louder than before, pouring every ounce of strength she had left into the sound. The bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the floor, and for the moment she felt like she wasn't trapped at all, like her voice had wings carrying her far beyond the walls. That was the night she heard him, a choked sound, muffled through the door. Not words, but a sob. Sarah froze mid-note. Her breath caught. He was there, listening for a heartbeat. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then his boots scraped the floor as he stood and stormed away, the sound fading. Into nothing, Sarah pressed her ear against the cold steel. Her pulse raced. She didn't know what it meant. But she knew for certain now. Her singing was not powerless. It was doing something far beyond the house. On a lonely stretch of road near the woods, a couple walked their dog. So the night was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the crunch of gravel underfoot. Then faintly they heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, fragile, but unmistakably human. The woman stopped, tilting her head. "Do you hear that?" The man frowned. "Sounds like singing." They listened, but the sound faded with the wind. The dog tugged on the leash, restless. They exchanged uneasy glances before moving on, unsure if they had imagined it. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The night air along the old highway was still and sharp. The kind of autumn evening when the world seemed to exhale after a long day. The leaves whispered underfoot as Daniel and his wife Marjorie walked their retriever. Jasper was there. Routine, a nightly stroll before bed. Small pocket of peace carved out from busy days. Daniel carried a flashlight, though he rarely needed it. The moon hung fat and bright above the treetops, silver light spilling over the asphalt. Jasper tugged at the leash, nose pressed to the ground, following invisible trails. Then Marjorie stopped. Her hand tightened around Daniel's arm. "Wait," she whispered. Daniel frowned. "What is it?" She tilted her head, her expression uncertain. "Listen." At first he heard nothing but the rustle of leaves and Jasper's eager sniffing. Then, faintly carried by the wind, came a sound that froze him mid-step, a voice high, thin, fragile, yet steady in its persistence. It was singing. Daniel swept the flashlight, crossed the dark stretch of trees that lined the road. Nothing moved. The voice wove through the night air like a thread, dipping and rising, haunting in its beauty. "Someone's out there," Marjorie murmured, her brow furrowing. "Probably a radio," Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe. Kids messing around?" But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't. There was something raw about the sound, something too desperate to be a recording. It was the sound of a living throat, of lungs forcing out melody against silence. They stood there for a long moment, listening. The voice faltered, rose again, then faded with the shifting wind. When silence reclaimed the woods, Marjorie shivered. That didn't sound right. Daniel hesitated. "We'll walk by tomorrow night. If we hear it again, maybe." he trailed off. Neither of them wanted to say it out loud, but the unease clung to them the rest of the walk home. Inside the house where Sarah was held, the singing had not stopped. Her voice was hoarse, her throat raw, but still, she sang.
Oh.
The hymns were her anchor. Each note kept her from unraveling. The man outside her door had stopped pretending he didn't listen. Night after night, he sat slumped against the steel, his face buried in his hands. Sometimes he pressed his palms so hard against his ears that his skin burned. But still the voice slipped through. He told himself he hated it. He told himself he could end it at any moment, that all it would take was unlocking the door and shouting her into silence. Yet he never did. Instead, he remembered Emily's laughter. The way she used to dance in the living room, arms outstretched, spinning until she collapsed in giggles. The way she begged him to sing along, though he never could carry a tune. The crash, the mangled car, silence afterward. The girl's voice dredged it all back up, no matter how hard he tried to shove it down. And in his grief, twisted by years of rage, he almost believed that keeping Sarah here was his way of holding on to something he had lost. The next night, Daniel and Marjorie walked the same path. The sky was darker, clouds veiling the moon, and the air carried a sharper bite. He didn't expect to hear it again. A trick of the wind, they had convinced themselves. But halfway down the road, Jasper stopped dead. Ears pricked. Then came the voice. Clearer this time, steadier. A hymn, faint yet unshakable, drifting through the trees like smoke. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Marjorie's eyes widened. "That's not a radio," she whispered. Daniel's flashlight trembled in his grip. He listened, the hair rising on the back of his neck. The song wasn't playful or careless. It was mournful, filled with a weight that pressed into their chests. "Should we?" "Check," Marjorie asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not tonight. But tomorrow I'm calling the sheriff." And though neither said it aloud, they both knew something was terribly wrong. Sarah never knew her voice had reached them. She only knew that when she sang, she felt stronger, less like she was disappearing into concrete. Sometimes after finishing a song, she thought she heard footsteps pacing outside the door, lingering longer than before. Once, she thought she heard something else, a faint sound, like a sob quickly swallowed. The thought unsettled her, but it also fueled her. If her voice could reach him, maybe it could reach others. Maybe someone would hear. So she sang louder, her throat tore, her lips cracked. But still, she sang. For the man, the torment deepened. He sat alone in the kitchen of the house, empty beer cans scattered across the counter, staring at nothing. Her voice leaked through the vents, even here, soft and persistent. Threading into every corner of his mind, he muttered curses. He slammed his fists against the table.
Ow.
But when the singing stopped, when Sarah paused to rest, he found himself straining for it, craving it, as though the silence that replaced it was worse than the torment itself. He didn't understand. He only knew he was unraveling, and outside the house, the world was beginning to notice. The following morning, Daniel stood in the sheriff's office, hat clutched in his hands. "I know how it sounds," he admitted, shifting uneasily under the sheriff's skeptical gaze. "But my wife and I both heard it." A girl's voice, singing out near the old Miller property. The sheriff leaned back, unimpressed. "Probably teenagers. That place has been empty for years." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Teenagers don't sing like that. Not at night, not like." He stopped himself, remembering the tremor in Marjorie's voice when she whispered. It didn't sound right. The sheriff scribbled something on a notepad. "I'll send a deputy to take a look, but don't go wandering in there yourself. Last. The thing we need is folks getting lost in those woods." Daniel left, unsatisfied but resolute. If the voice returned that night, he would make sure someone believed him. The morning sun bled pale light across the small Ohio town. Inside the sheriff's office, Daniel sat with his hat in his lap, explaining for the second time what he and Marjorie had heard. "I'm telling you," he said firmly, "it wasn't kids fooling around. My wife and I both heard it singing," the young girl's voice. Out near the Miller property, the sheriff, a broad man with deep lines etched into his face, raised a skeptical brow. Singing at night in the woods? You know how it sounds? It's probably just a radio. Teenagers get up to all sorts of nonsense out there. Daniel leaned forward, voice low, almost trembling. Teenagers don't sing like that. This wasn't some drunk kid shouting lyrics. It was mournful, desperate, like someone crying for help through a song. The sheriff sighed and tapped his pen against the desk. All right, I'll send a deputy to check it out. But don't go marching out there on your own, understood? Daniel nodded, though he left the office with frustration tightening his jaw. He knew what he'd heard, and he knew they couldn't ignore it. That night, Sarah sang again. Her throat ached, her lips cracked from dryness, but still she sang. She didn't know if it reached anyone, or if it only filled her own prison, but she couldn't stop. Singing had become the only thing tethering her to herself. Each note was defiance. A thread of hope spun out into the darkness. She thought of her mother humming in the kitchen. She thought of Mrs. Jensen at choir practice, smiling when Sarah hit the high notes. She thought of home, warm light spilling from the windows. Each memory wrapped itself into her voice, and the sound became stronger than fear. But outside the door, the man listened, and the more she sang, the more he came. Undone. He sat on the floor, back pressed to the steel, fists knotted in his lap. The songs twisted inside him, dredging memories he had long buried. Emily's laughter, Emily's voice, Emily's silence. The liquor didn't drown it. The pills didn't quiet it. The girl's singing seeped through every crack of the house, bleeding into the vents, slipping beneath the doors. He wanted it to stop. He wanted it never to stop, and he hated himself for both. Marjorie couldn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, staring toward the dark line of trees in the distance. What if she's still out there, Dan? What if she's trapped? Daniel rubbed her shoulder. The sheriff said he'd send a deputy. We'll know soon enough. But even as he said it, he felt the same gnawing unease. If no one listened, if they shrugged it off as nothing, what then? As if to answer him, faint and distant, the wind carried something into their ears, a voice. Marjorie bolted upright. That's her, Dan. That's her. Daniel's heart pounded. He grabbed his coat. This time, we're not waiting. I'm calling. The sheriff again. By morning, a deputy had been dispatched to the Miller property. He drove slow, skeptical, his headlights cutting through the fog that clung to the fields. The house stood crooked and abandoned at the end of a dirt road, its windows black, its roof sagging. He stepped out, boots crunching gravel, one hand resting on his holster. Silence greeted him, broken only by the caw of a crow overhead. He circled. The property, flashlight sweeping across peeling paint and broken shutters. Nothing. Then, faintly he thought he heard something. A hum, low and steady, slipping through a rusted vent. He paused, tilted his head. But just as quickly as it had come, the sound was gone. He frowned, muttered to himself, and returned to the cruiser. When he filed his report, he wrote only, house, vacant. No suspicious activity observed. Inside the room, Sarah's voice had faltered. She coughed, throat raw, forcing herself to keep singing. But the effort was draining her. Her stomach growled, her head spun, her body begged for rest. Still, she sang, because when she stopped, she felt herself disappearing. The man couldn't bear it anymore. That evening, he stormed into the kitchen, knocking a chair to the ground, slamming his fists against the counter. His reflection glared back at him from a cracked mirror above the sink-wild eyes, sunken cheeks, a man he barely recognized. He heard her voice through the vent. Faint, but relentless. His chest tightened. His throat burned. Stop it, he roared, slamming his fist against the wall. But the song continued, steady, unwavering, and for the first time in years. He felt tears spill down his face. That same night, Daniel called the sheriff directly. His voice was sharp, urgent. I don't care what your deputy wrote. She's there. My wife and I heard her again. If you won't do something, I'll go myself. The sheriff hesitated. He knew Daniel wasn't the type to make trouble. He was this insistent. Maybe there was something to it. Fine, the sheriff said at last. We'll send a team tomorrow, quietly. But if this turns out to be nothing, you're buying me coffee for a month. Daniel didn't laugh. He only said, You'll see. Sarah's voice carried into the night, weaving itself through cracks and vents, drifting into the air beyond the house. It had already reached strangers. It already stirred suspicion, and though she didn't know it, rescue was drawing closer with every note. The morning came gray and heavy with clouds. A thin mist clung to the ground as three sheriff's cruisers rolled quietly down the dirt road toward the abandoned Miller property. Her engines hummed low, headlights slicing through the fog. Inside, the lead car, Sheriff Harland, chewed the inside of his cheek, eyes narrowed on the crumbling silhouette of the house. He still wasn't convinced. Half of him expected this would be a wasted morning, nothing more than a wild story spun by worried townsfolk. But another part, a quieter part, couldn't shake the way Daniel's voice had cracked when he said, it was like someone crying for help through a song. The deputies moved into position. Two circled the back while Harland and another approached the front porch. The wood groaned under their boots, the paint peeling away in strips. The house smelled of mildew, abandonment, and something else, something human. Then, faintly from somewhere inside, came a sound, a voice, clearer than before, fragile hoarse, but unmistakably real. Harland froze. His deputy's eyes widened. You hear that? Harland nodded once, all doubt evaporating, signaled with his hand. Weapons drawn, they moved. Inside the concrete room, Sarah was singing through cracked lips, her voice nearly broken. Every note scraped her throat raw, but she forced it out anyway. She had promised herself she would not fall silent no matter how weak she became. She didn't know rescue was minutes away. She didn't know her voice had already reached them, but she sang as though the world depended on it. The man, the one who had taken her, was pacing in the kitchen, hands pressed against his head. He had barely slept in days. The girl's voice gnawed at him, drilling into the hollow spaces of his grief. He had shouted at her, banged on the walls, even threatened to tear the sound from her throat. But every time she began again, it was as though Emily herself had come back to haunt him. He looked down at his trembling hands. For years he had drowned his pain in anger, in bitterness, in cruelty, but this voice had cracked it open, forced him to remember not only what he lost, but what he had become. And in that moment, hearing the faint echo of boots outside, he realized it was over. The raid began with a thunderclap of noise. Sheriff's Department. Step out now. The front door exploded inward under the force of a battering ram. Deputies surged in, flashlights sweeping across the decaying interior. The captor spun around, eyes wild, cornered animal rage flashing across his face. Get on the ground, Harland barked. For a second the man didn't move. His chest heaved, his fists clenched. Eyes darted toward the hallway that led to the basement where Sarah was hidden. A terrible calculation flickered across his features. But then he heard her voice. Faint but steady, still singing even as chaos erupted around them. His shoulders sagged. The fight drained from him. He dropped to his knees, hands raised. And for the first time in years, he whispered his daughter's name, Emily. Deputies swarmed, forcing him face down, cuffing his wrists. He didn't resist. Basement, check the basement. Harland's voice cut through the confusion. They rushed down the narrow stairs, boots pounding, and found the steel door at the end of the hall. The sound of singing was clearer now, muffled but strong. Hang on, sweetheart, Harland muttered as he signaled for the lock to be broken. The battering ram swung once, twice, till the metal gave way with a deafening crash. The door flew open. Light from flashlights flooded the room, and there she was. Sarah sat curled in the corner, eyes wide and wet with terror, her small hands bound, her lips still moving with the last notes of her song. It's all right. A deputy shouted gently, lowering his weapon. You're safe now. Sarah blinked, dazed. For a heartbeat she thought she was still dreaming, and strong arms wrapped her in a blanket, warm and soft, and the reality of it all hit her. She was free. Her voice broke into sobs. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing a pale strip of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Neighbors gathered at the edges of the property, whispering, watching as deputies led the shackled man into a cruiser. His head was bowed, his face streaked with tears he refused to acknowledge. Sarah sat in the back of another car, wrapped in blankets, clutching a cup of water with trembling hands. She looked out the window, watching as the world, her world, slowly came back into view. When Sheriff Harlan crouched beside her, he asked softly, "Why did you keep singing?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "'Cause if I stopped, I think I would have disappeared." Harlan nodded, his throat tightening. He knew she was right. Her song had not only carried through the vents into the night, it had carried her through despair, kept her alive long enough for them to find her. By evening, the story spread across the county. News anchors called it a miracle. Headlines read, "Ohio girl rescued after song leads to captor's arrest." Reporters swarmed the sheriff's office, eager for details. But for Sarah, the world was quiet again, blessedly quiet. She sat at home that night in her own bed, her mother's arms wrapped around her like an unbreakable shield. Lydia wept into her daughter's hair, rocking her gently as if she were still a small child. "Your voice saved you," Lydia whispered, "just like I always told you it would." Sarah closed her eyes, exhaustion pressing down on her. But for the first time in days, she felt safe. She wasn't disappearing. She was here. She was alive, and her song had saved her asterisk. The house that had once held her was sealed off, the captor awaiting trial. For Sarah, the road ahead would be difficult nightmares, questions, a long work of healing, but one truth could never be taken from her. Her voice had been her weapon, her defiance, her proof of existence, and because she sang, the silence never won.